Hello everyone, today we talk about literacy, writers and readers in the Middle Ages. Well, as you understand, this is also another titanic enterprise, as basically it's very difficult to sum up such a topic in a short video. This is gonna be not actually about writing proper, not in I mean um, in the sense of the script, medieval scripts. Actually, I could talk about poliography, but it's going to be a bit of that too, a bit more of codicology, but generally speaking, it's about really the level, trying to understand the level of literacy during the Middle Ages. So there are enormous studies about this, and I realized I could go in depth to this because I had the unfortunate experience of, well, let's say the distinguished honor of studying actually poliography and codicology myself in one of actually the best centers in Europe actually, and unfortunately I didn't like much the subject, so this is why I kind of had a bit of a tormented relation with these subjects. Actually, it was just one exam that I kind of had to repeat. It was the first basic one of poliography, and not because simply I was told by the professor I had actually a good eye for poliography. Actually, I even lost some dioptry probably during the exams. Before I had a perfect sight. So actually, they're beautiful, beautiful subjects. I wish I actually knew more about them, and they were, however, a bit forced down to my throat when I was studying my for my degrees, medieval history, and I didn't like much this point. The reason is that objectively paleographers and codicologists are, yeah, they're kind of historians philosophically speaking, but they're much closer to the philologists or the linguists by certain standards than, at least on average, than to the people who actually take a degree in history. I say that it's obviously an approximation, but kind of gives you the idea. They're very technical subjects. I think I made a video back in the day about the experience of studying paleography specifically, and it was actually a short video. If you're interested about it, because I know there are many people who would like to learn paleography, and I thought to make that video to bit say what it is about. It should be now. I think it's in the historian playlist. So if you ever get interested about it, but I will definitely probably not ever make videos about paleography unless I wasn't asked, because it's as we're saying, it's a very technical subject, and it requires a lot of visual things, and it takes me a lot of time to prepare visual stuff. So I just stick usually these pictures taken from the internet as a background, and that's it. Paleography is a bit more complicated with that, but it's still very interesting because it's not. It's a kind of topic from how these people wrote, it's kind of weird and paradoxical, but you can't really better understand their world. And I'm not just talking about the broader spectrum poliography that obviously in codicology tells you what is that manuscript, where it was written. I mean, you can't imagine if you have never gone into the subject how many things you can get from a manuscript, really about how it was made, where it was produced, how it was actually built, physically speaking, but even if you look at just at the script, you can kind of look the actual think about the actual mindset of those people, and this is very important. Today maybe we will just address this topic, we will hint at it, but it's really a topic that deserves, and I realize this is not taught in schools, because obviously nobody, I think, learns about poliography and codicology. I've seen lots of people around the internet making kind of fortune showing how cool they replicated certain scripts from medieval times, etc. But there is actually a huge study academically speaking, behind these things, and that would be the preferable spring from which people should learn about such topics, because it's never about doing the cool thing that looks kind of medieval, and it's a like bit with well, I don't want to talk about, but people who reenact history in many ways, and some of them do really a good job. Others just do it because it's fun, and they don't properly get into the historical matters for what they are. I'm not saying that you have to be an expert to be a reenactor, and it doesn't work like that, but it's really important to look at what reenactment, I think, should be. Whatever activity concerns, you can talk about HEMA, you can talk about this Poliography. I don't even know how they defined as art, seemingly, of writing in the ancient fashion. But my idea is always that in order to master these crafts, you should kind of get thoroughly into history proper, because otherwise you're always gonna lack something out. And history, paradoxically, is gonna tell you way more than the practice. Now we are keen in saying, we are reliving that experience because we're experiencing the problems these guys had. Mostly, yeah, there are definitely great practitioners who can, and through intelligence and education, can definitely point out certain things that objectively from the sources we don't get, that are strictly material problems. But I see that at least how this happens most of the time doesn't take into consideration that. In fact, it's not a surprise that the best reenactors are actually also the ones who know history at a decent level. And it's always complicated to talk about these things, because eventually, not even historians are improper sometimes. We're not perfect. I personally realize I have lots of a lot of different gaps. Let's say I definitely don't write on many things I discuss, but I at least I leave the benefit of the doubt, and I always try to leave other people, more competent people, to talk in my place, and to make everyone kind of forming their own opinion. When you start taking certain individuals as models, as authorities, and that they are kind of your guide, I hope you will never look at me like that personally, because it's actually quite easy, especially when if you are particularly young, and you still don't know many things. You see someone who speaks about you have not the measure of criticizing that person and his or her knowledge. So these things out. But now I'm needlessly digressing. I like to digress to make a bit of a longer video, but sometimes I think to give some good food for thought, at least for making you understand that these topics, as distant as they can seem, actually they have a lot to do with our own life and the way we look at the past, and which is probably the most important thing when actually doing history. Excuse me, I drink a little before we start. So so I think we start from the Roman world, as this is also part of the great topics of discussions. The ancient world versus the Middle Ages, all these ideological clash that exists, and sometimes even when there are people who are very keen in making kind of classifications or ranking and placement of civilizations compared to their alleged level of advancement. And obviously, what we'll see now is that the Middle Ages do not come out particularly brightly from the, relatively to the matters of literacy that definitely were a bit more. And people generally say, well, in the Roman world, everything was different. Especially the imperial Roman times, the early empire was highly literate. This is actually true, definitely in relative terms, at least compared to the Middle Ages. If you look at the graffiti or the electoral writings on the walls of the streets of Pompeii, for instance, you objectively acknowledge that that was a very was a society to which objectively many people were capable of reading, of writing correctly. This was due in part to it's very complicated to explain. I mean, not complicated, it's rather complex to explain why this happened. The point is we often forget the same evolution of the Roman world, and we take the early empire as this phase of major, I don't know, accomplishments in civilization and so on, which is definitely correct, but I would advise everyone to look at history not as a sort of ups and downs relatively to an alleged ranking of civilization, because even those periods that were marked, like indeed the early Roman Empire, by these greater achievements that objectively impress us even at 2000 years of distance, have to be understood for the causes that brought to that. There was no progress in the way we imagine it. We, as modern people, we are literally obsessed by the concept of progress, of achieving in a positivistic fashion. There are many people. I discovered this around, by Tolkien. They can't do without that. I mean, history for like half of the people is about saying, okay, who was the most advanced, was superior, and who was inferior, and you realize that most of the people who reason in this way actually don't know really much about even the same criteria, or they don't even pose themselves the question on basis of which criteria such judgments should work, because if they did, they would immediately realize it doesn't make sense to reason in this way. The Roman society had grown to be so literate, indeed, because of a very high degree of social complexity that existed there. The Romans were a relatively egalitarian society compared especially to the Eastern world. We often think the Eastern world was more literate than the Western one. This is not truly true, at least in the Hellenistic age, as the Romans came from this kind of Italic background that was still based in a sort of tribal mindset, and it was partly reflected by the same republicanism of Rome, that was essentially that if you were a full Roman citizen, you were actually a free man. Nobody could touch you. The state had to intervene if your rights were violated, and you were essentially free. And this stemmed from a middle class that initially was an Italic, essentially, or Italian, because it encompassed also the Cisalpine Gaul in the north, that progressively, in fact, was extended also outside the borders of the peninsula. And in fact, it expanded into territories like Gaul or Iberia, or other regions that had this kind of eventually developed part of their middle class. Rome was naturally always, at all times in Roman history, an oligarchy. The people, as the commoners, have never really ruled in Rome, but definitely their life conditions were good enough to allow them to have a living, to have a certain wealth, to deal chiefly with business, because that what the Roman middle class was actually interested in was making this profits with their small medium property, and as long as that system in fact existed, and it's no surprise that literacy starts declining in the 3rd century, where practically the middle classes began to shrink and to become poorer and more subjects than citizens. So there was also a lot of trade, a lot of economical activities. There was a lot to build. The Roman world was expanding. It required a lot of planning. Think about all the cities that the Romans built up. Think about the resources shifting. So all this, as a consequence, as a kind of a structural consequence, needed people to be literate. And in fact, from the late Republic and the early Empire, the Roman state basically paid for tuition for some. It was a very different system from what our own indeed, because there were essentially public schools. And these were, however, conceived in a very different fashion from our own. They weren't obviously mandatory schools. They worked also in a very peculiar fashion for which you could attend them essentially if you were interested. This is also very kind of makes sense, and it was based more than on the years of practice or a particular ether, on the idea that the more gifted students essentially were to study more because they could, being more intelligent, more gifted, more predisposed, as you want to call it, could eventually develop their skills and make a living in the career into the Roman state or whatever. But it was a very pragmatically oriented education. It's not the ancient world kind of never had this huge interest in sheer interest for literature. This is in fact something I usually praise the Middle Ages mostly for, because the Middle Ages was probably in the whole history of humanity the only moment to which, or at least the highest peak of the human thirst, inextinguishable thirst of knowledge. Not even the Enlightenment arrived to that, because the Enlightenment was mostly concerned with creating new theoretical categories, eventually to fill with knowledge. So that was not, knowing more was not actually the real goal. It was more about the scientific criteria on the basis of which you could order reality. The ancient world was very practically oriented. When we think about for instance, the Roman world, all the libraries that existed also in the West, that were actually a copy of the Eastern ones, but the Hellenistic ones, people went there not to pick up books like you could do in a library today and read it at home. We're essentially going there. First of all, the libraries they had everything. They had swimming pools. They had places where you could eat. They were usually, in fact, in the forum, and there were if you look at the Trajan forum, that was it. There were two big libraries. One was usually by tradition in Greek, and another in Latin. People went there essentially to be read. There were kind of public readings of certain works, but that was it. You didn't really find anyone in the ancient world who picked up a book to say, okay, now I'm reading it at home from the library and then bringing it back. There were people who definitely had small, we know it actually, in ancient Rome there were certain, I don't even know how to say it in English, certain record book, or I don't know, certain booklets that with people who, I don't know, liked poetry and stuff like that, but it was never something more built. And even the greatly praised Hellenistic world was actually pretty ignorant, to tell it all. The great libraries like the one of Alexandria, or that existed also in other major Hellenistic centers, were actually closed to the public. Literally nobody went there. The only people who got in there were scholars of the royal court that went there to make certain kind of researches. They obviously didn't have nor the time nor the to look at all the material that was stored in there. So these libraries were actually kind of warehouses of material that remained stuck in there, and nobody consulted it. And even most of the alleged, technological advancements of the ancient world were not really there. They were mostly, ancient, science was actually 90% like philological stuff. It wasn't actually scientific, and also most of what was, at least, pseudo-scientific for our standards, in fact, was something like 90% was kind of fantasy, and there was a 10% that worked. Maybe, I don't know, you find that these people knew a lot about certain medicines, about certain plants, their medical effects, but it was mixed with literal fantasy. Just think about, I don't know, astrology and astronomy. They were literally the same thing at the time. But this has to be understood. You don't have to put a stigma to this, but I'm saying these things because most of the people don't actually understand it, because they are told the story that as if the ancient world was, the 21st century already happened, with people being intelligent or having the same kind of intelligence of our own, the same interest for science, for technology. No, it wasn't. It was a completely different world. We can't even imagine. This doesn't mean that we are more intelligent than them at all. Never fall into the pretty childish delusion that you are more intelligent than a person that lived 2,000 years ago, because you're not, most likely. And secondly, it worked in a much more pragmatic way, we think, because once again we have the chance of getting obsessed with things like, the idea of continuous progress, and this say scientifical work, the world that will have, simply because we have the surplus to sit our lazy asses on the couch and start thinking about that. In the ancient world, there was no opportunity like this, nor was in the medieval world. Of course, there were classes of, say, elites of privileged people who could dedicate it, in fact, to studies and so on. But it was a world that was dominated by completely different ideas. The scientific knowledge was extremely poor for our standards, and people were mostly oriented towards other things. Like, the greatest scholars at the time were essentially political thinkers, were never things like free thinkers at that time. Definitely, we have a world that gave to us a lot of extremely great thoughts that are still at the base of our civilization, but those are it. Like, surely there was something we don't know about that world, but we don't have to picture it as of something that has never been. For the same respect for that world, because those accomplishments are all the more amazing if you understand where they stemmed from. That is something, if you were projected in those times, you would not even bother yourself with, because you would probably just be concerned to survive, and you wouldn't have, in fact, the time of dedicating yourself to studying. And this is, especially this last thought, is how you should objectively see what eventually happened during the Middle Ages, as the educational system that had been developed between the second, third century AD, which allowed the greater part of the male citizens to, say, handle books and practice scriptures, it went disappearing. It actually, it was a very complex process. Now, I can sum it up easily, and it has nothing even properly to do with the collapse of the Roman Empire, in the sense that indeed it's really in the 5th century they kind of began to kind of to crack, we can say. And in the 7th century, by the 7th century, even in the East, it kind of disappear. Now, a huge chapter would be dedicated only to reasons of why this happened, and I might be doing this in the future. However, let's say that the simplest and the brutally concise answer to this is, it was mostly, as always, a political and social change. Those middle classes, they were the ones that had made up the sop of this literate, I don't know how to say it, activity, or had disappeared. Society was transformed into a, it was crystallized, especially in those worlds that, and in here you can't really blame, there was a great structural collapse. So this is something you see at every level. You can start complaining. These are the same reasons why, why is that? Well, it's because the Roman Empire fell, because they were so corrupted and so on. All the powers at that time were equally corrupted by definition. So corruption is not the reason why the Roman Empire fell, at least not the determining reason. The barbarians arrived, were so wild, they couldn't read, they couldn't. This is not even true, because if you see what the Germanic rulers did in post-Roman times, actually, you understand they were pretty interested in the power of writing. It was a much more structural and by certain standards irreversible reason, and it had to do with the same shrinking of society, of even the things that are related with strictly economical problems, like the crop rate, like the available resources, so that people had firstly think how to survive in a world that already into Roman times wasn't actually that enormously literate, because we often say, well, even this fact, for instance, that the majority of the male citizens, by the way, at the time of the early Roman Empire were literate. Are we sure about this? Because we often forget. I mean, if this is in the cities, I believe it is true. I mean, there is nothing really wrong about. But what about the countryside? The vastly forgotten Roman countryside, the rural world that has been the base of every pre-industrial society that nobody talks about, and that incidentally didn't produce a big deal much of sources. In fact, why? Because those people were largely illiterate. If you were I don't know, a Gaulish peasant that I don't know, that had been living through in the Roman world, and that lived in this highly Romanized area of the Empire of Gaul, like in central Gaul, and if you had to work for your local master, what was the point of reading, or knowing how to read? What was the point? So I really don't think the majority of the, not even of the male Roman subjects actually knew how to write, because we tend to concentrate the attention on the cities and never thinking about the rest of the population. So sometimes we're not even Romanized in any form. I mean, especially vastly great areas of Central Europe remained under the Roman control for half of a millennium, but didn't practically get a big deal of Romanization in there. And this is all the more meaningful considering that, in fact, no place got completely Romanized, like an exact copy of what was happening in Rome and even Italy was relatively diverse in its, think about the Apennine region has always been more detached from the rest of the coasts, and this is valid for every single place. And I do know that actually there are studies which suggest the contrary, that say the fact that so many people were literate at the time. But to me, I still think it's excessive, and most of all, and this is probably the most important thing, we have to understand what we mean by literate, because one thing is actually just knowing how to write and read. One thing is to be as literate as we are today, that is using, reading constantly every day, being able to write, to formulate concepts, etc., because those are very, very different things. So sure, there were lots of people, possibly also the majority of male citizens, that knew how to read, but it's not that they would do it every day at all, because the majority of the people at the time were still working like peasants. They were still living a life that maybe entailed some form of need of writing, etc., but outside of the cities, and all the complex let's say dynamics that were connected to the activity of writing and reading that could be the most diverse, not necessarily everyone was practically literate, and there was no actual need for really using to be able to write or to read every day, because life was extremely different from that. It was still based on activities that were not intellectual, were highly material, highly physical, and you learn certain things only if you have the interest to. So that's how we've seen with the same Roman schools. These were created for those who wanted to be educated, who wanted to access that because they thought they could make a living out of their, of their intellectual skills, but most of the people wouldn't. And the same, say, average Roman it is true. Most of the people, at least in the cities, went to school, telling the truth. And we have plenty of evidence in Roman times how this worked. But also in there, it was like learning just, most of the people would learn just how to, in fact, to read that minimum that served to understand a written writing. That's it. And to count, also numbers, mathematics was taught, but in fact, very simple things. And that's it. That was the form of literacy. And it's already a huge achievement because other societies in the world didn't behave like that. So it's obvious that the Roman levels of literacy were something where basically that would present, I think, just like in 14th century Florence for the first time after the fall of the Roman Empire. So almost at the end of the Middle Ages, but there were still also very different ways of being literate, and for needs that sometimes are comparable, because also in Florence, for instance, the need for people reading and knowing how to read and how to write was mostly a practical, like related to trade, especially to these commercial activities, and that's how we have to see it. Not a world with like ours where we can really read and write without problems, at least in part, because actually if you look at the literacy rates in the West, there are certain devastating data concerning this that tells you that arguably what we called like functional illiterate people, that is basically, yeah, being literate because you theoretically know in fact how to read and how to write, but not being able even to understand what it's written on a book, or not being able to write something meaningful, consistent, without massive grammar mistakes, or so we should be mindful most of all of the mechanics that so better of the dynamics that existed between these need of being literate and how functional they are to society. So you can't, if you know what the history of, I don't know, of Europe between the 5th and 7th century was, you can't really understand why literacy disappeared. And not to take that as a, oh my god, it crumbled, it was so beautiful before. No, because what had happened before, for just like a pair of centuries, by the way, because before the 2nd century AD and after the 3rd century AD, Roman society, so the majority of Roman history, by the way, was in a certain way, and that level of literacy did not extend. Also in here, we shouldn't be excessively, like in Rome there was a high level of literacy even, I don't know, in the 4th century BC, or I don't know, we should talk about those periods, because also in here we have the myth of the early empire, and we should better focus, better understand. But that, what I mean is that was, even the early empire was the exception in this. You shouldn't be surprised or depressed or angered by the fact that at a certain point the Roman Empire fell. Because, why did the Roman Empire fall? Oh my god, it was an empire who lasted... Where do you want to count it from? It lasted a freaking lot. Even if you take... Okay, let's leave aside the Eastern Roman Empire. It was the same Roman Empire, by the way, who lived up to the 15th century. But my god, which other empire in history had achieved what the Roman Empire had achieved in the first place for such a long time? You should rather ask yourself, how was it possible that an empire was able in the first place to last so long, and not to pretend in a completely progressivist and positivistic way that I don't know, the Roman Empire had to rocket to the moon and to discover all the technologies of the 19th century in a few centuries. from the meager potential of the ancient world for no reason, just because to fuel your pseudo-scientifical fantasies of how history and history of technology is really about. Let's stop with this rubbish. Study books on history of technology. Don't stop to what people tell you because just they're fanboys of this and that. Be real, be objective. Do not think history can be bended to your own wishes, because it doesn't. And you're talking about people who are the ones you have to be thankful for what you have, actually. Because even the Middle Ages, as many people think, it was not a dark hole where nothing happened. We most likely owe to the Middle Ages much more than we're prone to admit in our pop culture, which is a shame. I personally think that people who believe in the Middle Ages as a dark age are some of the most despicably ignorant and stupid people that ever live among us. But aside from this, the idea is never think of history like in teleological terms. Try to understand history. That's the cool thing of history. You can keep learning and never stopping, because you're gonna die before having read even a tiny part of all that it exists. So it never gets to the bottom. You never finish that. It's something you can dip in, and that's enough. Instead of judging, learn. It's much more convenient for everyone. So, passing to early medieval times, so getting really excuse me, into the moment of greatest shrinking of literacy. Excuse me once again. There is no doubt that the widespread literacy that was typical, especially of the cities of the late antiquity, the Western society of especially between the 7th, I would say, and the 6th, and the 11th century, was essentially an illiterate society. As society was in most of history, actually, most times in history, because also in here, as we were saying before, just think about the degree of romanization. I mean, one thing is talking about, I don't know, Naples. One thing is talking about York. There are so many huge differences between the Mediterranean kind of remained a bit more in shape. It took more time before it actually this even late antique society kind of contracted. Somewhere it happened more violently. Somewhere it happened, let's say, more progressively. But let's say the Mediterranean was always, for instance, at all times, even during the moment of greatest contraction of international trade during the Middle Ages, a quite active place from a commercial point of view. So in here, for instance, the local, especially coastal centers, maybe in the interland, obviously, illiteracy was almost complete, but in centers that dealt with trade, international trade, and had to put up ships and deal with goods and political relations at a long range, it was obvious that people would still learn how to write and to read. And it's not something that, this is also something people rarely think about. It doesn't take really a huge lot of resources to actually learn how to read and to write. So it obviously, you have to see it in another way, that the society in itself requires a huge resources to provide for a person, for having, let's say, an elite of people to be able to be in the condition, to have the free time, to have the resources to learn how to write and read. Hmm? And not because it takes a lot, but because that person is taken away from other, like, labor force and so on. So it's especially more complex societies can always kind of carve a space for someone to deputate him or her, most likely him, sadly in history, to read, to know. There were many literate women, telling the truth, even in the early medieval times. And we would be surprised actually how frequently women were literate, also compared to men, that were usually the ones who got the great, say, the highest education at the time. But it's obvious that in the rest of Europe, this kind of complexity, this kind of even, because that's the point, there was no need to read or to write. If you are, I don't know, a peasant living, I don't know, into Central Europe, you have just to mind about your land, your livestock, and so you live essentially your life is concentrated more or less in your district, in your village. What's the point of reading and writing? If all, the greatest thing that happens is the annual festival where, there's maybe a market, there are people coming from other regions, you come to meet them, you maybe talk with them a little bit, they speak different languages, but they almost go, and all you have to do is like to work the land all the day. Yes, of course, maybe during the market you need people to make some measurements for how, that resource weighs, in order to pay them with with other good, actually, with other goods, but barter in this sense is a bit more approximate. You don't need a lot of knowledge of numbers, of written things. You just live for it. What's the point of you wasting, I don't know, years of your life and resources, in fact, that you could have produced in the meanwhile, just for reading? What are you gonna do with that? So where's the involution here? Where's the inferiority in here? It's actually intelligence. It's pragmatism. You don't need to read. You don't need to write. So it's not something, reading and writing is something you need to be a better person. Not necessarily. Never think to be more intelligent, I don't know, than a 7th century Bulgar cavalryman, because most likely you're not. You're nor more intelligent nor more capable, and that person had a living on his own that might have not been better than yours in terms of lifestyle, etc., but he didn't have many options. You had many options because you lived into an industrial society. You have a huge surplus that your society produces for you to do many things, including reading and learning how to read. So that person didn't have. The person had to survive in a world that was extremely poor, and you didn't have time to stop there thinking how to form these weird shapes on a sheet of pergament, that, by the way, of vellum, that, by the way, costed a freaking lot of a freaking lot. We'll see it later. And in this sense, think that there were still manuscripts circulating. So I'm thinking, in such an extremely poor world like the early medieval one was, think about the importance that was given, however, to the written word, to the script, for making circulating manuscripts that were created from the skins of hundreds of sheeps that could have instead maintained, I don't know, a local clan, for instance. And think about, even in that context, how important was the concept of the written word, and how allegedly it was probably even more precious than in our times. In parallel terms, today we have the whole knowledge accessible through the internet. How many people do learn things? No one. Nobody cares. Do you understand how truly inferior we are? If you really want to reason in terms of superiority and inferiority, well, probably we don't have to be even so harsh towards ourselves, because we have also in here we have our other needs, our other dynamics in society that before being judged, should be objectively understood. But it's still remarkable that, for millennia we struggled for having an education. Now we can learn everything and we don't even care. This is a paradox, but so it is. So there is actually a pretty rich historiography about these topics, especially trying to understand through the sources that are extremely scanty the degree of spread and the dimension of the phenomenon of literacy or illiteracy, say, during early medieval times. Because another matter that is extremely important is that not necessarily, this is maybe complicated to express, but well, maybe we'll leave it for another time. However, I'm giving you some names if you're interested in bibliography for the 19th century. The major scholars who dedicated to this problem were Giesebrecht and Dresdner, and in the 20th century Thomson, Viscardi, Richet, and Ballag. So these all dealt with the problem. There is also a problem of not just of sources, but also of trying to think how we can go see beyond those sources as well, because our problem is not just, we don't have many written records from the early medieval times, so this means that that's all that there was. Obviously there was much more, and surely it wasn't even so strange to produce written documents at the time, especially in post-Roman Europe. There was a kind of a tradition of a knowledge of realization that of acknowledgement, let's say, that there was a past in which people wrote, and definitely also Christianism as the religion of the book brought this idea that the book was. In fact, this is another point that people never hardly get. That is how important was Christianity for the spread of literacy. Many people get this ideologically speaking because they say, Christianity arrived and destroyed the knowledge of the ancient world. This is another childish interpretation of how things worked. This is absolutely not true. It is true that the Christians destroyed part of the knowledge of the ancient world, but if you look at the Christian intellectuals from the late antique, you realize these were people who were soaked into classical literature, and they saved also a lot of the ancient world. Also because they were saying essentially what the fathers of the church were interested in fact, as in terms of looking at the classical world, and this triggered in part the survival of such books through the so-called Dark Ages, in the sense that by that time nobody else would have basically been interested in such works if objectively the church had not treasured them and tried to preserve them over time, and saying and thinking they were extremely precious, and that there were texts that, despite being written by pagan authors, had to be remembered in the future. It could be useful. And if you study Poliography, you realize that actually the spreading of the Bible was a very powerful spin-off developer, I don't know what term to use, for even accessing the books. I mean, the first Bibles actually produced the kind of handbook we know today. In Roman times, there weren't things like this. There were kind of, there were small, I don't even remember they were like booklets, essentially. They existed, they circulated massively, but they were sometimes very tiny. They were kind of pocket books, etc. With Christian times, the Bible had to be brought literally everywhere, even among the least educated. This is extremely important because, as we were saying before, the late antique society was essentially a Christian society in the West. And also because, by the way, Christianity spread in the most literate centers. Christianity mostly spread into the cities, and the countryside took actually a lot before being Christianized to the Middle Ages. and therefore there were many people still into the to the 5th, the 6th, the 7th century that were Christians, and they had a kind of pocket Bible, but built in even codicologically speaking, in a more consistent way. The Bible was actually read constantly, so it also required a more resistant structure as a book. And it was, in fact, the kind of handbook, with the pages together. You could, and not just rolls or other things put together in a bit of a precarious way. The binding, in fact, was stronger, and from that you understand that these books were much more used. So actually, Christianity didn't at all brought to the end of literacy. If anything, it kind of allowed to save much more of what was known into the classical world, because if it had remained on the premises of that classical world, that were getting, by the way, ever more elitary in the form of access to the reading and writing, we would have lost probably even more than was lost at the end of the ancient world. This is also another point, that education in the late antique kind of became a sort of status symbol sometimes. It was, however, growing sterile. We'll say it now in a while. Over time there have been new researches that brought very important data, thanks especially to the studying of the subscriptions in the early medieval documents. That is essentially the signatures that were posed by on the documents by the witnesses, in chiefly the contracts. This was also another thing that at the bottom, at the footnotes, if you want to call them, because people think that in fact in early medieval times there was no literacy. There is also this perspective depending on which country you're used to think, because it's obvious that, I don't know, in early medieval England, literacy was very low. If you take the Lombard Kingdom, for instance, you realize that the commoners, also because it was a higher, it was the in the world the highest, the wealthiest per capita country in per capita country in the world. There were actually lots of contracts. People knew how to write. Literacy was relatively high for those times. Standards were more deals, more business involved, and people wrote. And there is a huge quantity actually of documents relatively to for those time standards in such regions. So if you look at these autographs and you that is essentially these writings by those we were signing, and not of the, for instance, of the officials like the notaries. So of the common people who subscribed these contracts, you can kind of calculate very approximately, of course, the quantity of people who were, the percentages list of people who were able at least to write their own name. So if you look at the 7th century, it was actually probably kind of the darkest hour. It was the moment of greatest contraction, the moment of greatest decline of social complexity of etc. In this, if you look at this study was carried out on the cities of France and of the Italian cities of Roman tradition, like Rome and Ravenna. So those had remained practically into the Byzantine orbit. Basically, first of all the ecclesiastical subscribers knew how to read and write. And 60% of laymen could write their name. So this is usually said, well, 40% couldn't. Well, yeah, okay, but we're talking about the 7th century. That's not really a few, for the stereotypical picture of this extremely wild, dark, depressed moment, having 60% of the people could actually know even how to pick up a something actually a pen to write. Well, it's not a few. It means that this practice still kind of exists in Prague. And we're talking about, however, we're talking about France and Italy, that were kind of some of the most socially complex countries at the time, and also some of the wealthiest, at least in the West. So that meant a lot. Natural literacy was higher into Italy than into France, and this was due to the fact that the average Italian was richer than the average French. And this brought massive changes into society. Also, naturally, Italy at this point was kind of already still more connected to the Mediterranean traffics, were more extended. So all factors that eventually can highlight causes and consequences that would change. For instance, if in France there had been the same per capita wealth of Italy, there would have not existed feudal Europe, for instance. So even in here, we have to understand that not necessarily everything that is, and I'm not saying feudal Europe is kind of a better or worse society, and arguably probably I would prefer a society where everybody's kind of well off than a highly stratified society like in the feudal one. But the idea is that also part of our civilization and certain accomplishments stemmed from societies that were less literate. Just think about Rome. Rome in itself. I mean, the Romans conquered the Hellenic world, the Hellenistic world, that was definitely more literate than them. And we don't know how history, would have gone. Many people say, well, maybe it would have been better if the Roman Empire had not existed. Others say, well, maybe not, because it still gave it so much. So if you think about Roman law, the concept of a Roman state, or that is all something that stemmed from an empire that originally that was possible because there was a less literate society that was more about than the one that eventually conquered in the East. Many people said, well, but these Hellenistic city-states were kind of making their own scientific revolution, but that's rubbish. There wasn't anything like that. They were surely experimenting much more than the Romans, technologically speaking, but they had no chance to basically apply to applicate that technology proficiently at a structural level. So never think there would have been the scientific revolution of the 17th century or the industrial revolution in the 18th in 3rd century BC Mediterranean, because it's completely fantasy. But just for saying that history can produce certain things that eventually trigger a higher rate of literacy from societies that do not have this. Is paradox, and the Roman Empire is a perfect example. The highest levels of literacy were such in the Roman Empire. You can argue because also it was Hellenized in part. The Roman Empire by the 2nd century, 3rd century was definitely an Hellenistic power by certain standards. But it also was born, I mean, there was the chance to do that on such a massive scale because it had emerged from this kind of pretty rough Italic society that managed, because of its warlike nature, was not keen at all on literature and on literacy in general, that managed to conquer the known world, that you could obtain that. So history takes strange paths, but it's not, and this really, it's really complicated to say, okay, this was better, this was worse. Let's try to understand how it happened in the first place. However, these data are definitely remarkable. So for the 8th century, there are more complete data that by certain standards are not so so comforting, however, because there seemingly was paradoxically a further decline. It's kind of strange because usually the 8th century is taken as the century of greater of the beginning of the kind of the revival of at this point we can say high medieval Europe, at least the beginning of high medieval Europe, because if you take Lombard Italy, so sticking to the most literate place in Europe at the time, you have that essentially the clergymen were by majority literate. So not all of them actually. And by the way, now I'm wondering whether in the Byzantine Empire there was a higher degree of literacy by the 8th century, but I'm not really sure. I think actually the Italian peninsula was still the most literate place at the time, or at least we had extremely similar rates of literacy than in Byzantine Empire at that moment. Because, by the way, the Byzantine Empire had an extremely similar socio-economical development to the West. And so, telling the truth, also the Near East, the Middle East, so there were certain phenomena that were pretty transversal, and also these, changes in literacy rates actually reflect this broader and massive structural intercontinental changes that have not much to do with the individual choices, telling the truth. So in Lombard Italy, it looks like the majority of clergymen by the 8th century was literate, and that, however, the laymen capable of subscribing in a notary document were only 30%. And especially there is no woman at this point that ever seemingly that is part of the group of the literate people. This is just naturally a sample of a specific reality, and our evidence is scanty. We don't really know. Obviously, there were literate women. Obviously, there were areas that surely, on a narrower scale, were more literate or less. So it really depends. You don't have to take these numbers as a general standard. But it's interesting because it seems like that between the 7th and the 8th century, things even got worse, paradoxically, in terms of literacy. And it's weird because seemingly instead economy was beginning to rise once again. So what does this mean? Well, it means that probably society was changing perhaps a bit for the worse. I believe that also the middle classes now were, because not necessarily when economy expands, middle classes are doing better necessarily. There are many times into history in which actually the economical expansion corresponds to the enrichment of just a very few people. It doesn't happen all the time, but this is the case also because I know a bit of Lombard history indeed in those times, and definitely by the 8th century Lombard society was a bit more troubled than the 7th one, in the sense that in fact the freemen were getting a bit poorer and the elites were getting a bit more powerful. So that can explain this passage, but at the same time economy was expanding. So we see two things that we are usually prone to associate literacy rates together with economical progress, but this is not this is one case where it's not true. and we're talking about the cities here. So if you go into the minor centers or in countryside, you realize that the lay literacy was drastically reduced compared to the cities, and sometimes obviously it didn't even exist. Lay literacy, because naturally the clergymen were the most educated people at this point, so the degree of the rate of literacy was higher. So this happened in part because the church was better organized as a community than other branches of society. The church was also very wealthy at this point, so it necessarily needed uneducated personnel to deal with these properties, with these resources. So this is partly also why, naturally, they had to read the Bible, yes, but that was not really the main point, because if you go across the Alps, if you go into Germany, if you look at what the Carolingians were complaining about in that time, relative to their own clergy, if you go to places like Bavaria, you realize the clergymen couldn't even read Latin. I mean, they were translating the Bible, like inventing the words and not understanding anything about it. So also in there, it doesn't just take, to be a clergyman, to be educated. It also needs a society that is kind of better off. And in Italian peninsula, in fact, the church normally had quite large properties. So this is what also entailed partly the alphabetization. Also in Central Europe, obviously the church was kind of powerful, at least in those areas where Christianity had spread. But one thing is having a large estate that is connected to a Mediterranean trade, and but certain centers like like cities that are connected to to Constantinople, and one thing is just having a land in a Central European place that's pretty pretty detached from kind of the major trade nets and so on. So you have completely different goals. So, excuse me, let me check in here because I'm getting so many with the... Okay, so going on, there's another factor to consider, that is the documents subscribers made up still a very narrow elite compared to the rest of the total of the population. So this is very important because objectively, yes, we have seen that in certain contexts maybe literacy was not so disastrously absent, but the standards, the Western European standards, were definitely pretty low, and the majority of laymen could not definitely even write their own name. And we can't just look at quantities here. We have to look also at because as we were saying before, one thing is actually being able to, because it's relatively simple to know how to write your name. It doesn't take a freaking lot. Every child can learn it relatively easily. Another thing is how used you are to write and to read. And naturally, if you look at and also this is the field of Poliography, if you read how this script was practically performed, let's say, and you look at the formal characteristics, you realize that the type of script, the kind of writing, was extremely different from the one that existed into the Roman world, was when there was a writing teaching at a structural level for a more widespread use. In always sticking to Italy, you see that in Longobards times, the type of writings were essentially two. One was very agile and speedy writing, and this was the one of the notary class. So the notaries, obviously, that were the arguably, probably even more than the clergymen, the ones who used writing because they were professionals of writing at the time. And notary documents are extremely important to understand certain societies at the time. So they were quite used to write, and they did it pretty easily. Their type of writing was instead extremely much more difficult. It was very kind of hard earned. It was very elaborate in the way it was written, and you realize it quite easily if you look at these documents. And it's very interesting because it happened to me to read a bunch of these documents. When you have the subscriptions of a contract, usually you have several signatures. So it's very interesting because there is the signature of the notary, of the various contractors, essentially. So maybe there were, and according to who the person was, you can understand so many things. For instance, from the same name. I remember I think there was a contract in the 8th century Rome. There was the signature of a abbess, and she wrote fantastically with a beautiful writing and a beautiful signum as well. The signum was essentially a little symbol that was used and put close to the signature to say, okay, this was your own symbol. It was especially used by notaries, even in later times into the Middle Ages, as if it was a mark of sign of authenticity of your own signature. So not just illiterate people marked with a cross. Actually, this almost never happened. The signature was written by extents. So here you can see, according to the various, and these people usually wrote next to their name also what their profession was. So this is extremely useful because it shows you all these various segments of society, from the businessman to the notary to the abbess to the average, who knows what they were, from their name. At this time, the names are very important because in this Latin Germanic society you still find certain ethnic differences. I mean, if you read a Germanic name, you don't have to think that was a German, but it was someone who maybe was a nobleman who had this kind of ancestry, or maybe if you read a kind of a more Greek-sounding name, you might have thought, oh, this guy comes from an area that was more from a more Roman area than this point where there was still contact with the East, with the Greek-speaking world. So this is why paleography is so fascinating, because you can get an excruciatingly amount of information you can't even imagine. And by the way, it's also very moving because you see the signatures of these people from I don't know, from 12 centuries ago, and you say, my God, these were people just like us. And it's one of, if I think about it, it makes me want to cry sometimes because this is probably what I love the most about history, seeing that these were living people just like us, and maybe we don't have anything more about them, if not this sign. And you can see it from the actual pergamene, the sign, the place where this person kind of signed with his own hand. And looking at these differences, these social differences in literacy rate, etc., to say, okay, who knows what that person really was? What kind of oh my God, sorry, I've got incoming mail. But for saying, this is really fantastic. And naturally, there are areas of Europe about which we don't know we know nothing about this, and usually, in fact, in the least developed places, most of the documents we have are the only the one from the clergy. So which is pretty obvious. But also in here there are many changes, because not all the clergymen wrote in the same way, and we'll see now also how things varied in the on a geographical scale. So relatively to this difference in the two type of writings, we can say that there was still at this point in the early medieval times a kind of a elementary education that allowed those laymen who wanted to learn how to write to do it. And this usually happened still through the ecclesiastical institutions, because actually the ecclesiastical institutions in the Middle Ages were usually quite open also to laymen. This myth that the clergy was kind of a bit more isolated, even in the monasteries, this is not true. There were many laymen that came visiting. If you look also at there were professionals at this times, like the enlighters. Sometimes when a monastery wanted to produce a beautiful manuscript, an enlightened manuscript, they usually hired someone from the saculum, let's say, and they so he came, he was paid. It was actually pretty florid. This started happening mostly from the 11th century on, but we know, in fact, even if there is no evidence before, because it's too scanty, that this thing was still living. And this is also another beautiful thing of history that you look at, is that not necessary that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So that we're extremely lucky in the first place to get certain sources, and this doesn't let us indulge into thinking that those sources are the picture of what it was. There were for that source, we know that there were thousands of other sources that were produced in a similar fashion all over Europe, and a world that lived without evidence for us, but that we know was there, obviously. So this is also pretty moving, because these are kind of traces, kind of hints, kind of that we have of something that existed, of people who lived, and that about whom we have nothing anymore, unfortunately. So another datum that we get from this is, however, that the difference, the distance between, say, the gap between those who wrote for real, that means that used the writing pretty often, pretty with ease, with comfort, were very few, and that the other and that the other people were kind of having really a very elementary education from this point of view. Another phenomenon that is also extremely beautiful, and that you study in Poliography, is how the groups of literate people were increasingly more isolated one from the other. This is very important because it's the history of civilization in many ways. Humans have always traveled, they've always communicated. The world has always been global from the very moment we left Africa and began to colonize the rest of the earth. There's never been a moment in history to which people didn't communicate even thousands of kilometers of distance. They didn't share their experiences. They didn't, and at this moment, culture is influenced by this kind of isolation that went in parallel with the economical contraction of early medieval Europe. In fact, as long as the Roman Empire had remained out there, chiefly up to the 6th century, I mean, connecting basically at least the whole Mediterranean and parts of continental Europe, between the the 6th and the 7th century was an increase in the gap between the let's say the differentiation, the variation of the writing of the scripts used into the different countries of Europe. This is very important because when you study paleography, one of the first usually paleography, when you study especially Latin paleography, which is the one I studied, I didn't study Greek paleography, you have these manuals that start obviously with Roman times as the origins of they usually end up to the Renaissance, so with printing came into use. So at that point it's not just a matter of paleography, it's a bit of a different but for the early medieval times, you have the first chapter is dedicated to the differentiation of the various scripts in the various countries of Europe, and these take name from the various regions of Europe. The Longobards had their own script. It was sometimes differentiated. The Byzantine areas of Italy had their own script still, aside from the fact that some of them were written in Greek or in Jewish or etc. The Spanish had their Visigothic script, as it is called. In France, there was the Merovingian script. Then the Carolingians eventually they don't really invent, but they basically, and we'll arrive to this now, but they say the Anglo-Saxons and other British populations, they had the insular script. So the Carolingians eventually arrive and basically revive the Carolina, as it was called in Latin, so practically the Carolingian script that is still at the base of our own script. Quite interestingly, and that tells you how important were actually the Carolingians for this, especially their ecclesiastical reform, their fit, because this started especially for the church. I mean, the need of creating a Carolingian script stemmed from this idea that the whole church had to be organized together, that there had to be theoretically a state that could use this thing, and the Carolingian script eventually reconnected all the various European lands, and because they could now finally understand each other again. Because I can assure you, it's very difficult to read an early medieval writing. There was such a high degree of differentiation, you don't even know where certain writings came from. These are terrible writings, to tell you the truth. It's one of the worst you have to learn when you study paleography, but they're still very meaningful because they show you how every single region of Europe kind of developed its own script. And this was simply due to the fact that communications had decreased. So there were certain pools that remained kind of developing their own ideals. And this is very important because at a broader level, this reflects also the political fragmentation of Europe. And given we're talking about especially written records, so and we're talking about the church most of the times. And this is important because at the time, every church had kind of its own organization. Like the Italian church was different from the Spanish one, was different from the Gallic one. There was a sort of competition between the various centers of Christianity. There was no primacy of the Roman bishops at this time, if not from a symbolical point of view. So this lack of coordination corresponded actually also to a degree of autonomization and the creation of different prerogatives of the... Then eventually Europe was kind of prevented from this happening because eventually the Spanish church was, it was quite powerful at the time, had developed its own liturgy, etc., was wiped out by the Arabs, or at least it wasn't really wiped out in the sense that this remained. The Mozarab also script and liturgy remained, but it was for, and these last Christian powers of Spain, confined to the north of the peninsula, kind of decided to bow to the papacy in order to get some help, and that's disappeared. Then the Carolingians did this great work of homogenization, as you want to call it, of the European script. They associated with the Church of Rome, so this axis between papacy and empire was created, and is also brought into the field of writing, of script, of certain homogeneity. Other areas of Europe eventually were kind of Frankishized, and the Frankish script was essentially the Carolingian one, and eventually the so-called Gothic one that was actually called modern writing at the time, Littera Moderna. So the Gothic script eventually was, this Carolingian, because it really evolved from the Carolingian script, and this had been exported, into England, for instance, with the Norman conquest. It was exported into southern Italy, that had remained kind of very differentiated, because there was Latin, Greek, Jewish, and even Arab writing. So the Normans kind of uniformed once again the script, with bringing the Gothic writing that was being developed into northern France and into southern England, and that eventually spread in all over Europe as as a symbol of universalism as well. But before this, everything was different. And this contributed also to characterize certain local differences at so many levels, not just from a writing point of view, but also from the actual contents of this. And this is very useful also for us to understand the various differences that existed within the same Germanic kingdoms. Another element that brought to this lack of homogeneity is that by the 6th century there was the final disappearance of the lay library workshops that had really expanded a lot between the 1st and the 2nd century AD. We have found, I don't remember where it was, I think it was in southern France, an archaeological site that was essentially this library workshop that not only produced books, but also stationery, writing materials, and this was essentially at an industrial scale. It was massive. They were able to produce, I don't know how many inkwells, ink pots for all over the Western Europe. And I don't remember. This was ruled initially by some brothers. They even had a name. I'm sorry, I've forgotten it. I remember it from the exam of Poliography. But it was huge, and it kind of gives you a dimension of how important writing was in Roman times for these guys to make a living out of these huge exports of just ink and stationery, something like that. These workshops, these laboratories, I don't know how you want to call them, began to essentially collapse by in late Roman times, and eventually they disappeared by the 6th century. So this also brought to it's not really a cause, but rather a consequence of the lack of also need of writing, and the idea that there was no market anymore to export these goods, because nobody was interested in paying for them. This is the same moment to which the cities are getting abandoned, to which people get into the countryside. I made a video that is called just a few days ago, Transformation of the West, 3rd, 6th century, that actually deals not particularly with this problem, but about how society changed over time. This is this can be useful. Excuse me, I was checking here something that, oh my god, it's pretty okay. And there was a transformation, though it's not that writing disappeared as we've seen. There was rather a differentiation and especially the splitting on these centers in smaller I don't know, scriptory centers that were scattered pretty much everywhere, and usually were at this point revolving around the cathedral chapters in within the cities, usually in the bishoprics naturally, but also now with the spread of the monasteries around this, in fact, monastic centers. So that this is a typical trend also for other activities that were, at the end of the Roman Empire, these huge infrastructures kind of crumbled. There is actually no way, even before the active destructions of the infrastructure, there was no way to maintain them, because there were no resources to do it anymore. So in many ways, economy shrank on these smaller centers that were kind of more economical, they were more practical for providing the service to delivering the service to the local communities, and so we're now the writing centers. So these new centers of writing basically had nothing to do anymore with a public of people a public that needed to acquire certain material, or foreign or strangers coming to to read this the writings that were produced. And also another thing you notice in codicology especially is that the same manuscript begins to have a very different meaning. Still, by the 5th century, there were things like public auditions and people gathering to the libraries, and things that had still changed. Had already changed a lot from previous times. A few libraries were actually opened, others were ruining, also in the centers of the most active cities like Rome itself. But by the 5th century, this system kind of still worked. There were still some intellectuals that had this public commitment into the city, so they made also a bit of a self-promotion and so on. At this point, what you see from especially the mosaics of places like Ravenna, for instance, you see that the book in this still living late antique world was opened. So this symbology was symbolism was very, very important, because it showed you that people were interested in actually even reading what was written in it. They were not just passive listeners or passive contemplating the book they were actually interested in the contents. This was getting truer naturally for the senatorial elite than the great masses of the populations that were now growing increasingly, even not just not interested in reading, but also practically not capable of doing it, because they had another life. Then they were colonists in, I don't know, in a pattern's latifundium. They had to work all the day. What was the point of reading at that point? Well, you're just trying to work hard every day, and you're just tired, you want to go to sleep. But the Roman senators put a big deal, especially in the West, they put a big deal of importance, of emphasis on their written tradition, because they felt to be like the last heirs of the classical legacy, and especially the Latin one. Interestingly, there were substantial differences also between West and East, and don't think that the Western senators were less educated than the Eastern ones. If anything, it was the exact contrary, because at this time, between the 5th and 6th century, the Byzantine elites were actually being formed through a much more meritocratic way. So some of them came from the middle class, and they were actually educated during their same career to the classical knowledge. But it was a pretty standard knowledge. They had to learn things like the Iliad, the Odyssey, that they had to have those essentials to become part of this Roman bureaucracy. But there were newcomers. Even the same emperors sometimes were people coming from the middle class or the military class, so classes that were usually not that educated. Especially the Romano-Italic senators of Rome or of Ravenna were extremely posh in a certain way. They objectively were the real descendants of those initial Roman senators in their Latin tradition, because the Romans objectively, from especially the 3rd century BC, had their own literature, their own historiography. It was specifically Latin. Obviously it was influenced by the East, but it was a completely different world. I mean, still at the end of the Republic, think about the different political models. In the Hellenistic monarchies, there was this semi-god nature of the rulers that all the subjects had to obey to. The Roman Empire was technically an oligarchy, an oligarchic republic. So even the concepts, the models of education were quite difficult. The Romans also absorbed the Greek models in very particular ways. It's just later that the elites kind of got more Hellenized in the sense they began to speak and read. Actually read Greek, also speaking it, but let's not try to stress that too much, because the West kind of always remained in a different fashion from the East. And actually, certain parts of the West were also pretty heavily Hellenized. If you take southern Italy, southern Gaul, or those were definitely the places where people spoke Greek fluently, but in the hinterland it was a really different world. And this kind of Latin or Romano-Italic world, you can extend it also to the Gallo-Roman world, because also the senatorial elites of Gaul were extremely developed at this point, very well educated. They kind of maintain a bit more this idea of social prestige, because their society had not seen that different change on different bases that had happened in the East. They remained essentially the elite, and the rest of the populations was pretty now becoming serfs. Constantinople worked in a different way. So the social prestige of the senatorial elites of the West had brought to objectively a much higher degree of education than the Eastern elites. And you see, especially when there were many refugees that came from Italy to Constantinople, some of the most prestigious senatorial families, like the gens Anicia, for instance, from which eventually also Gregory VII would stem from. So here and there you see the passage between the Roman and even still a bit pagan, at least in literary taste, world transforms into the Christian world into places like Rome. So the centers of the whole thing in the first place. They went to Constantinople during the Gothic War, because Italy was being ravaged, and the senators fled from there. And you see this in Poliography and Codicology, these beautiful manuscripts coming from Italy into Constantinople, which were much more refined and much more a product of a much more elitary world, intellectually speaking, than the one of the East. And that's the reason why also the Western elites kind of always kept despising one of these, because they kind of wanted to remain into the empire that now had its center in Constantinople, but they still felt, that they were kind of special, and obviously wanted to enjoy let's say, a certain degree of political autonomy by hoping to maintain their power into places like Italy, in fact, but not and not being too directly subjected to the Constantinopolitan rule. People of huge culture, indeed, a huge education, huge refinement, that however were a bit blind to see what was happening also in the West, and that eventually got ousted, deposed, literally, by the Germanic rulers in the West. And don't underestimate, however, the importance of the Roman elites into the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, because actually, if you look when the Germans came into these lands and they began to build their own kingdoms, but it's and writing their laws down, for instance, or creating some from scratch for ruling both the German and the Roman subjects. But obviously these were being taught by the local elites, because these were illiterate. The Germans were illiterate, so they there was a great process. There was a great hybrid also in here between the Germanic and the Roman world, as it's widely known. And it's obvious that the Germanic kingdoms got pretty much Romanized, especially if you take Spain. Spain was extremely highly Romanized. The Goths in general were like this. Even the Ostrogoths in Italy were kind of Romanized in their own, not excessively, but still practically working with the Roman elites. This is widely known that in Italy, while the Ostrogoths were all about war, and they used the Roman fabricae, they equipped their troops with Roman armor, they organized the whole military command of Italy on the base of the Roman military infrastructures. The Roman elites were left by the Ostrogoths to deal with all the public problems, essentially, and to rule, actually, and to dispense justice, to carry out all those administrative activities they were perfectly capable of performing as being Roman senators, having their own clienteles and all. And this was a bit of a factor of weakness of the same Ostrogothic kingdom, because eventually these senators always wanted to be reintegrated into the Roman Empire, and they asked eventually, and that's the reason why eventually Justinian sent Belisarius to reinvade Italy, and destroying Italy in the process, by the way. So it was a pretty dramatic, controversial thing, but if you look even in Lombard times, where the senatorial elites were wiped out, there was still a lot of Roman influence into the Lombard models of rule that eventually came from a completely different tradition from the one these Germans had, and especially the Lombards that were absolutely not extremely superficially Romanized, were not used to. So even writing the Lombard law was a great process of integration of the values of this community into the Roman world, and this obviously shows the ability also of this Germanic populations to create something different from what they were used to, and to make it work. Especially in the case of Italy, it worked very well. But another brilliant example is the one of Gaul. Gaul it's a very particular environment, because basically the Roman, the Gallic, and the Germanic elements coexisted very effectively. Also in here there were certain kind of problems, because eventually the Now, this will go for another time, but that kind of was a successful thing overall. And these cultures intertwine immediately pretty easily. So what else can we say? Oh yeah, we were talking about these manuscripts that were showed as open. It said, if you look at the manuscripts of the 7th century, so at the very end of the last because how these intellectual models of the ancient world died out is something extremely progressive also in here. For instance, at the beginning of 7th century Gaul, you still find this very last Roman, or now partially, say, Germanized Roman intellectuals who still had their own little, they were called zooteculae in Latin. There's this kind of little closets in which they treasured these last books from the ancient world that they still felt to be the depository of. It's very fascinating, even kind of romantic as a picture. But if you look, and in there, obviously, as we have seen, by the 7th century, writing was becoming very, very rare. But if you look at in the Eastern world, in the Byzantine Empire, you realize that now there is a great change in iconography compared to the 5th century, because the books that are represented are closed. They're all covered in gems, in precious, they're built with very precious, expensive material. Also the ones of the 5th century were represented a bit like that. But now, this is the most meaningful thing. The book is closed. It is represented as closed. And this means everything. So in this process of closing of the book, this means the manuscript was not read anymore. It rather represented certain aesthetical, symbolical, and even magical, evocative values that were now connected with a completely different view of the world, a world that had indeed a bit closed it in itself, like those same books. This is a moment of 7th century, the Islamic invasions of the great change, a moment to which the ancient world passes on the defensive also in many ways, and it definitely transforms into something else. So the closed book represented definitely this process, and definitely the proof that the book was more than an object, like a tool that you could use to actually read in a very pragmatic fashion. It was just a symbol, a status symbol, because only the elites now could even afford such books. And now, what arguably more important, what the book binding looked like, what the surface, the cover was, how many gems, how many precious stones were put in it, how good it looked. Because it was not about reading it anymore, it was about the actual value of the book. Because you could sell it, it costed a fortune, and just the elites kept that. Like an investment, because this was an investment. A manuscript at that time was like having a Ferrari. Simple as that. But even more, probably, because if you look at the cost, a manuscript was an enormous expense, much more than a Ferrari today. Actually, it really, the ultra elite only could afford such things. And this, however, doesn't mean that there weren't other forms of books that obviously we can't really look at in detail, but these were pretty rare. and this is proven by the rates of literacy that were definitely pretty low and sinking, as we've seen. So, and many people, in fact, have questioned this process in the sense that, are we sure that the especially about reading, people didn't actually read? Because one thing is having to write, right? But reading is a bit different. Um, if you have to write, it's because you have to do something actively with that. And for me, it happens to write a lot now because I have my research going on and I have to write my. But most of the times I just read. So you might question, but in this early medieval times, are we sure that people were so illiterate just from seeing that from writing? Because these people might have been still able to read a lot. And this is a very complicated question, because the general answer is no, because there is evidence now we will see that would suggest otherwise. But it was not everywhere in the same fashion. Another very important indicator for looking at for answering this is epigraphy. Epigraphy, is this writings that were essentially publicly exposed. This was a tradition that went on since ancient times, where life was extremely public, was very much outdoors. You have to consider this also when studying ancient writing, because also people had a completely different relation with their own homes. The Roman apartments were very, very small. People lived most of the time outdoors, also because the most of the houses were kind of slums, and it was also pretty unhealthy to live in there. Also pretty dangerous, by the way, because it could collapse or just get on fire frequently. So there was a lot, as we've seen from the Pompeii graffiti. There was a lot of writing out there that people could read from literally everywhere. There are lots of electoral slogans. Was a very exterior world, and epigraphy was very important because the Romans had this very extremely standardized epigraphical forms of writing that were conceived also to make the best effects, also with the say chiaroscuro, if you want, effect. How the letters were sculpted, practically engraved into these panels, usually and of marble, and then there were certain metal letters that were fitted into the cracks, into the where it had been sculpted. So this had especially even on the distance with the sunlight, it gave you a pretty clear dimension of what. If you go to Rome, you can see. But this was a style that was eventually practically spread everywhere. Every kind of classical-looking, neoclassical building has this kind of characteristics if there is something written on it. And you see in early medieval times that in those cities, especially of Romano Byzantine tradition, say how you want to call it, there was still pretty much of this. Like epigraphic evidence in certain cities of the Mediterranean kind of lasts for a very long time. Also, the urban elites in places like Milan, for instance. So these cities of the, let's say, post-Roman world that, however, had remained quite prestigious, also in Romano-Germanic times, kind of were stressing their own municipal pride by showing off, saying, "Oh, look what we are." Especially epigraphies were created by the local elites to when they built something, a public work, let's say, and saying, "Look, I did this because I'm of this family." So this was a hugely prestigious thing. This was part of the ancient avergetism that existed already in the Hellenistic world, and that was actually still pretty much alive at this time in the late antiquity, especially. There were certain families um, that had by law certain prerogatives over the cities, because it was actually, even in old Roman times, it was the local oligarchies, the local aristocracies that actually ruled and managed the cities. And they built all these infrastructures like the arenas, the aqueducts, the things. The state paid a very few. The Roman state was extremely light, actually. During late antiquity, it kind of became more structured, especially in bureaucracy, but still essentially the management of the local cities was entrusted to certain aristocrats that were extremely proud of their titles, of their honors, because they also contributed to the Roman state as administrators, in fact, and they left this epigraphy in early epigraphies when they built, and in early medieval times in the Romano-Germanic world, in certain cities these aristocracies had remained in practice, and they kept doing something like that. And you can see that even certain prodromes of the communal society are started at this point through this municipal pride by saying, "I belong to this city." Just imagine what it meant for early medieval times to live in a city, a real city. A urban centers with walled towns. It was pretty much extraordinary. So the aristocracies that lived in there were extremely proud of that, and they showed off through this epigraphy. But if you look in those, especially into those Mediterranean centers where there was a lot of even in Rome, but mostly in southern Italy and in these regions, there was a lot of Greek epigraphy still. So it meant that people also could read in Greek there. You see that this went on for a long time, and that literacy was pretty much out there. There are so many beautiful even graffiti that you find somewhere else around churches that tell like the believers how to behave in there during the mass. There is this idea that there was also in there a little bit of a reading capability that probably was more intense definitely than the writing one, because it was easier, definitely, just like today. We definitely read much more than we write. So many people question, for early medieval times, people didn't write that much. We've seen it, but how much did they read? Well, it seems that obviously the answer is approximate, because, as we've just said, things could really vary a lot, and probably would be surprised on how of the huge importance of even in other contexts that have not left a great deal of trace, how the visual impact of certain things influence society. But if you look at at paleographical evidence, especially for those manuscripts that predate the 12th century, so in the moment of the moment of real recovery of active writing at a widespread level, you see that the writing lacks actually a great confidence with reading as well. Because if you look at how the letters are spaced, or at punctuation, or the rationalization in the use of capital letters, you understand that people were not used to read a big deal, and that those writings actually came from a society that didn't also read a big much, because they weren't writing for being read in the way they did. And it was already something if they could read in practice. So it's possible also in here. Before I said reading was more, yeah, probably there were still more people that could read than to write, as it's normal in history. But also in here, probably was the same concept of writing that had come out of most people horizons in post-Roman times. Also, given the spaces where these people lived, as we've said before, we always forget rural society. A rural society was completely out of this. I mean, also in here there were many differences. For instance, when the Ottonians arrived into Italy, and they wrote by the 10th and the beginning of the 11th century that it was incredible how many people were literate in Italy compared to Germany. And these councillors were advising the Ottonian emperors to say, let's try to educate also the German youth like they do south of the Alps. Because and at that point we know that indeed in that phase the Italian countryside was also literate in part, which came from the fact that in there the countryside was pretty much connected with the cities, differently from Central Europe. And therefore there were more trade activities. There was a longer range trade that was organized by these societies that necessarily required a greater interaction within the same, and therefore more means to understand each other, even to take accounts and so on. And obviously Italy is the extreme case because it was definitely the most literate place in Europe. But this doesn't mean that other countries didn't work at the same level, but using different systems. This is the point. So, looking at this period, that is actually the kind of the darkest one. Indeed, I mean, as you know, I don't like the term dark when referred to the Middle Ages, but early medieval times are dark in the sense that we know less. We have more difficulty to see in it, historically speaking. And we observed that indeed reading was pretty rare, to be strictly objective, and there were certain particular contexts where this happened, chiefly ecclesiastical centers, but also this kind of more economically developed areas, especially of Southern Europe, that kept on with a greater confidence with writing and reading, and the rest simply had no reasons. This is the point. Had no reason of reading and was practically essentially illiterate. So this was the point I wanted to make. I hope I was clear enough. I know there was a bit of ramble as usual, but it's part of what my videos are. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.